Why are we doing this? No, I was listening for recap. I know we're here to save the goblins from the blacksmith's daughter, but why are we actually doing this? Do we? Is this worth giving up our lives? That's a good question to ask in a campaign where you're trying to figure out what's going on. You're trying to get the players involved into picking something that they want to do. You're getting them invested in a plot of their own making, right? A good sandbox is 1,000 side plots that all feel like the main plot if your characters are invested in figuring out what's going on in that specific instance. So it's good in a big scope, but in a smaller scope, when we get down to what's happening in this encounter, it can be kind of dangerous if you as the dungeon master don't have that example. So today, that's what we're going to talk about. We're going to be talking about how everything should have a why behind it. We're going to be referring back to that NPCs video a little bit and kind of breaking these down piece by piece and talking about how we can use the ways that we have motivations and what things are willing to sacrifice in order to get their motivations completed, as a way of explaining how individual encounters can be made a little bit more fun, especially in a sandbox setting where we can encounter things in a bunch of different ways. We're not really trying to set up a plot. There's not really a design of, oh, this has to have this specific motivation here because we need it to have a motivation down the road. So let's jump right into it, and let's do it with an example. When we go into seeing what the encounter is going to look like for this sandbox, if you're rolling it up right as the players are getting into it, if you're using wandering monsters or random encounters, or even if it's just, something that is something you've already built into the world, but you're not exactly sure what's happening when the players get there, you want to kind of set up how they're doing things. And there's a bunch of tools out there, for example, the Tome of Adventure Design, and there's also random things that you can roll or just tables you can look at and pick one that looks interesting, where you can say what the monsters are doing, what the encounter is doing when you see it. Because having a group of goblins that are fording a river, or they're trying to go and collect firewood, or they're on patrol, or they're fleeing from orcs or from a troll, those are all going to have different interactions, and you should be able to answer that. The other thing here is when we know what the people want, the people here being the monsters, what the antagonistic part of this encounter wants, and what they're willing to sacrifice to get it, like we talked about in the NPC videos, we're going to be able to give them a stance, a perspective on the encounter. And then once we get done with that, we're going to be able to look at what the players want and see how those things match up, and that can give us an idea of what this encounter might look like. And if there are confusions about, I don't understand, why did the players not flee? Why did the players not pursue this monster when it ran away? Why did the players not ... If you're trying to figure that stuff out, well, it's probably a mismatch of expectations. What you thought was going to happen because you didn't really understand exactly what the players' motivations are and kind of what their goal was and how it was going to match with the encounter. So let's take the example of a Wyvern. A Wyvern is typically a two-legged draconic thing with big wings and a scorpion-like tail. It's going to stabby. It has the sort of coolness of being a dragon, but it is animalistic intelligence. These things can be big predators. Now, what we can do here is talk about what they are motivated by in a couple of different situations, and we can see what it is willing to give up in order to keep that motivation going. In order to keep that desire happening, what is it going to do to try to get it done? Well, let's say the adventurers encounter a Wyvern that is up on top of a promontory. It's on a rock. It's just had a big meal. It is sunbathing. It is enjoying laying out in the sun and basking in the afternoon. Well, what it wants to do is to be left alone, and what it wants to do is enjoy the sunlight. It wants to just sit there and digest. What is it willing to give up in order to do that? Well, not a whole lot. If you aggravate it, it'll take off and fly around, and it'll wait until you're not there or find another rock to lay on. If that's the way that it's going to be, if that's the way that the adventurers encounter this thing, its desire is going to be get away. It's not there to engage the PCs, and what the PCs are doing when they're interrupting its rest, what it wants to do is get back to resting, and that might be hard if they have to actually fight for it. That doesn't seem as much fun. They would need to be trapped in order to return to this, and that would be more on the player motivation side. Okay, well, what about that same thing? It's not a full Wyvern. It is out hunting. It wants something to eat. Nom, 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 nom. And the players might look juicy, especially if they're low level. And they can say, okay, well, what we want is to just get from A to B, and the Wyvern comes down and attacks. Now, a Wyvern that's hunting, it probably doesn't want to fight to the death. It's going to want to get food and leave. So it's going to go in, and if it finds this group too hard of a nut to crack, if it gets bloodied, gets reduced to half health, it might just fly away. It's done. It doesn't want to engage. It's here to eat and continue its life. It's not going to fight to the death. That's a different perspective than the sunbather. The sunbather is just going to immediately flee, or it might immediately try to scare you off or something like that. A creature that's wanting to hunt wants to be silent. It wants to sneak up. It wants to attack from a position of advantage, whereas the creature that is just trying to scare you into getting away, it might also want to put itself in a position of advantage, but it's going to posture. It's going to treat that a little differently. By the same token, if that creature is protecting a nest, right? It is sunbathing, but behind it there is a nest of eggs. That is going to have a very different thing, right? If that thing believes that you are threatening its children, depending on the DM's perspective on things, it might fight to the death. It might be very defensive. It might try to scare you away. It might try this idea of frighten first, and if it doesn't work, then we'll engage. Kind of gives a mix between a idea of fighting to the death and impressing, right? It doesn't want to engage with the people. It wants the people to go away. Now, conversely, if this Wyvern is attempting to impress a mate, right? It wants to be seen as the strongest, most powerful, most dominant creature in the territory so that it can get its busy on and make one of those aforementioned nests. Now, that monster might actually fight to the death, or might fight to so close to the death that before it realizes that it's in mortal danger, it can't get away, because it is doing things that are designed to sort of show off. Maybe there's another Wyvern flying in the distance that it is attempting to impress or attempting to show off, or maybe it's planning on taking one of the bodies of the people that it is planning on killing and placing it at the edge of its territory to mark that it is powerful and potent and would make a good potential mate or a bad potential rival if there's another rival Wyvern area that might be close by or might be connected to it. Maybe a younger male is muscling in on his territory, and so he is going to kill something that looks impressive and position it to the edge of his territory and say, if you mess with me, this is the kind of stuff I can do, so stay away. Now you might think that's a little bit more than animalistic intelligence, but it isn't really. That is how a lot of predatory creatures work. So think about that, how the Wyvern is going to approach the party and how it's going to approach the encounter. By the same token, the players are going to do the same thing. They're going to be trying to have a goal. Now, this is not a goal that we've set for them because we're playing in a sandbox here. This might be something that we put in front of them as a possible option, something to engage with, but the players want to do something, and depending on what that is, they're also going to have a different expectation of what's going to happen. If the players are trying to get to the dungeon, eventually, they don't have anything they really need to do, they just need to eventually get there, they don't have a time crunch, they might decide, hey, we'll fight that Wyvern. They might actually decide that they really want to go after it because if in the edition you're playing, this Wyvern is a big bag of hit points, but that also means they're a big bag of experience points, then they might want to go after it. If you're playing in an edition where fighting monsters isn't going to get you a lot, you want to avoid monsters to get loot, to then get experience from the gold you get, well, then they're definitely going to want to avoid this thing. A sunbathing Wyvern and a party that's just trying to bypass it to get to the dungeon are going to pass like two ships in the night, and you're not going to have that problem, but you might have that encounter give a little bit of life to your world, right? It'll feel a little bit more full. It'll feel more real and realized because everyone has motivations and everyone has things that they want to have happen, and the PCs don't want to sacrifice their time in order to deal with this thing. They want to continue moving. Now, if the PCs are on a time crunch, we need to make it to the dungeon before the Lich finishes the ritual. Okay, now that's a time crunch. Now they definitely don't want to go after this creature. If that creature is hunting, it's a problem, it's a threat. Get it out of the way so we can continue moving. They might decide, we really don't want to spend that much resources on this thing. We don't want to go with overwhelming force. We are going to posture because we don't want to spend a lot of spells and hit points and things to get this thing to go away because we need those for fighting the Lich on the other side of things. And that's going to change the way the encounter is designed. It's going to change your sort of dramatic tension here because the goals don't line up as well. By the same token, if they are adventurers that are out there to assess the threat in the area, right? This is a dangerous new area. There's a new town that's being founded here, and the town has tasked the adventurers with dealing with the threats in the woods. The adventurers might decide, we could kill the Wyvern. That is an option. That will deal with this threat. Or we could scare it off. We could tame it. We could do something with it. We can mark its territory and just tell the people, hey, this is where the Wyvern is. Maybe if we sacrifice a goat to it every now and again, it'll leave people alone. They don't necessarily have to kill it, but they might have a bit more motivation to actually engage. By that token, if you take it one step further, you might have the idea of a bounty, right? The players are going, there is a bounty on Wyverns, and we need to go and kill this Wyvern in order to collect that gold. And even if you're playing an edition where gold is the primary objective, if you tied this monster's death to a gold reward, well, now it's the same thing. It's EXP in a different guise. So what you want to look at is how these two things are going to match up, right? If you have players are going for a bounty and it is trying to impress its mate, well, you're going to both have a thing where the players want to fight. They want to take this thing down. Their goal is kill the monster, and they really want to go for that goal. And the goal of the monster is, I want to have an impressive fight to show off to a mate or a rival or something like that. Those two things match, and you can have what I would consider to be more of a traditional modern day or video game inspired combat, where both sides are going to square up. They're going to fight more or less to the death. Now, by that same token, if you have one group of players that they are there to fight that, they are there on a bounty to kill the Wyvern, but the Wyvern is sunbathing, well, that's going to be a very different encounter, right? If the players can't cripple the monster, if they can't prevent it from getting away, it doesn't want to fight them. It's already eaten 4 rabbits this morning. It's going to go and do something else. It doesn't want to engage. And so that encounter might look like a quick see if they can get the jump on it. And if they can't, it's going to fly away. And then they might have to track it, figure out where it is, find its lair, figure out what at the edges of its territory are, right? It's going to be a very different feeling encounter than the other one. And when you know what these two sides want and what they're willing to give up for it, the Wyvern wants to impress the mate. And it's willing to give up a lot because mating is one of those things that makes us do stupid shit. If the players want the bounty and they're willing to risk their lives because, come on, it's Dungeons and Dragons, not Dungeons and Run Away, you want to go and adventure. You want to go fight the big thing. You want to go on this adventure to go and do the thing. If that's the way you're setting it up, then it's fine. Just be aware that when these things mismatch, you're going to have things that change your world, and it's not always for the worse. And if you're sitting there thinking, I don't understand why the players didn't do ... then, or conversely, I don't understand why the players got upset about ... because the way it was for me was very clear. Think about how your expectations were. Were your expectations completely different than the players? Was the monster's desires different from the players? How well did you show that to the PCs? Did you explain, were you explicit? Hey, you see it out, it's bathing, it seems relaxed, it's chilling in the sunlight, what do you do? Right? And if you fight it and the Wyvern flies off, they might go, well, why? Why did it fly off? And you say, well, it was sunbathing. It looks like it's got a bit of a full belly. It's flying away because it doesn't want to deal with you guys. You look dangerous. If you tell your PCs, this is what the motivation of the creature is, they can usually fill in that blank of what it's willing to give up for it, right? If you tell the PCs, as you start fighting the monster, you see a nest of eggs behind it, they see the motivation and they can guess this thing might fight to the death. And if they don't want to engage that thing, they might be able to go, if we need to retreat and regroup, or if we want to go around this thing, maybe we can make it clear to the creature in some way that we aren't going to be engaging it. Even a creature that looks hostile, if their goal is make it to the dungeon before ... then they can use that understood motivation to properly engage with that encounter, right? This monster is hostile, but it's because we're close to its nest. Why don't we make some animal handling checks or show our hands, make a big deal about walking away from it and walking a long way around it? And is that something we want to do? That then puts it in front of the players so they have enough information to make an informed decision. If we avoid the Wyvern's nest, we don't have to fight it. But maybe the Wyvern's area, it wants you out of its territory entirely. Maybe you have to go for a couple of miles to get around its territory, so you know it won't engage you. But that means that the ritual might be done by the time you get there. Are you willing to take the time to go around it rather than fight it? Are you willing to spend the resources to actually fight this Wyvern and get it to be killed or withdraw before you go to the dungeon and fight the big bad? You save time, but you spend resources. Or the other way, you save resources, but you spend time. And I think if you approach encounters like this, especially in the sandbox, and again, you can use that Tome of Adventure design and several other lists that can give you ideas about the different ways that some things can come across, that'll make it to where your world and your sandbox feels a little bit more alive. The last note that I'm going to talk about here is that this is not always two sides. It can be 3 or 4 or 5. You can make it as complex as you want to, but I would recommend not doing more than 3 different sides. If you have a group of adventurers that go out to a farm, that there's problems at the farm, and there's a Wyvern that is on top of the farmer's house, and the farmers have pitchforks and stuff, and they're trying to scare it away or whatever, knowing the motivations of everyone involved is going to be very important. The farmers want their things not to get eaten by the Wyvern. The Wyvern wants food. It's very straightforward. You can do it that way. But what if the Wyvern went in the middle of the night and chose, hey, this hay barn, or this hay bale at the top of the barn, it was a really nice pre-made nest. Look at this. Perfect place to lay an egg. Now you have a different encounter. You have a different adventure. You have a different feel. And you should think about adding these in and understanding on a micro level what the motivations are of each of your encounters and what they're willing to do to get to the end. And as you build on that, you'll find the options of stuff you can do are so much more varied than everybody puts their feet in the ground, plants their feet, and tries to kill each other. And the more intelligent, the more diabolical your creatures are, the more options they're going to have on their list. The monster doesn't just need to relax, eat, procreate. It needs to now complete that ritual. Now, its goal is complete the ritual. It's not to do all these other things. It's going to act differently. It might try to cripple or dissuade someone from coming in there because it needs its resources for the ritual, right? So think about what the motivations of an individual encounter are and what they're willing to give up to actually make that happen. And I hope if you do that for everything, that it'll make you feel like when you're in the moment, when you're in the encounter, not only do you feel like both sides have a reason for doing what they're doing, but when that question is answered, right? If the monsters want to be left alone and they're trying to scare you away and the PCs leave, even if everyone's still on the board, even if we're still in initiative order, if the dramatic question has been answered, end the encounter. We're done. What we're here to do is to resolve conflicts through encounter. If the conflict is resolved, but everyone's not at 0 hit points or people are still relatively close to things, don't drag it out, end it. We're done. We have figured out what the answer is, and now we're ready to move on to the next adventure, the next encounter, the next set of motivations, and what they are willing to give up in order to accomplish their ends.